"Remove her," the White CEO said, his voice sharp enough to silence the clinking crystal and quiet every whispered conversation in the room. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire restaurant stopped breathing. Silverware hovered above porcelain plates. A pianist's fingers froze over the ivory keys without pressing the next note. Even the soft glow from the chandeliers seemed to hold still above the polished marble floor. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she was, balancing a polished walnut serving tray against one steady palm. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply met Richard Coleman's furious stare with calm brown eyes that carried neither fear nor defiance, only quiet certainty. Richard stood near the center of the private dining room, his tailored navy suit immaculate beneath the warm lights. At 52, he had built a reputation as the man who never tolerated interruptions, mistakes, or embarrassment. Tonight mattered more than any quarterly meeting or shareholder presentation. Around the long table sat investors, attorneys, and executives gathered to celebrate the final hours before the largest acquisition of his career. By tomorrow morning, one signature would place him at the head of a corporation worth billions. Nothing, and certainly no Waitress, was going to distract from that moment. Two security officers immediately stepped forward from opposite sides of the room, their polished shoes echoing softly across the stone floor. Guests exchanged uneasy glances but quickly looked away. Nobody wanted to become part of whatever had just unfolded. In places like this, power had its own gravity. People learned to stay out of its orbit. Naomi slowly lowered the tray onto a nearby service station before folding her hands in front of her apron. Her uniform was spotless despite the endless dinner rush. The simple black name tag pinned neatly against her white shirt reflected a thin line of chandelier light. It read only two words: Naomi Brooks. Earlier that evening, she had greeted every guest with the same gentle professionalism, remembered every complicated order without writing a single note, and smiled at exhausted kitchen staff who barely had time to breathe. Nothing about her suggested someone looking for attention. If anything, she had spent the entire night trying to disappear into the background, exactly as exceptional waitresses often did. Richard pointed toward the entrance without taking his eyes off her. "I don't pay people to interrupt my conversations," he said, each word measured with icy precision. "Escort her outside immediately." A nervous manager hurried forward, his face pale beneath the restaurant's golden lighting. "Sir, perhaps there has been a misunderstanding," he offered carefully. Richard didn't even acknowledge him. "Did I stutter?" The manager's shoulders dropped. Years of experience had taught him when resistance would only make things worse. Across the dining room, conversations dissolved into complete silence. One young attorney quietly closed his leather portfolio. A woman seated near the end of the table lowered her coffee cup without making a sound. Somewhere in the open kitchen, the rhythmic hiss of a grill became the only noise left in the building. Naomi inhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then looked past Richard, not at the security officers approaching her, not at the anxious staff surrounding them, but toward the tall glass entrance overlooking the city lights beyond the lobby. Her expression never changed. It was as though she were waiting for something only she knew was coming. Richard noticed the glance and mistook it for hesitation. "You should have stayed in your lane," he said coldly. "Now you're leaving." Neither of them realized that beyond the restaurant's revolving doors, an elevator had just reached the top floor, and the people stepping out were about to change everything. Naomi Brooks did not become calm in difficult moments by accident. Life had taught her long ago that raising her voice rarely changed another person's mind, but holding onto her dignity always protected something far more valuable. Every weekday began at 5:15 in the morning inside a modest brick duplex on the west side of Chicago. Before the sun climbed above the rooftops, she prepared breakfast, organized her mother's medications into a small plastic container marked with the days of the week, and left handwritten reminders beside the coffee maker that simply read, "Drink plenty of water. I will be home after my evening shift." Evelyn Brooks smiled every time she found those notes, even though she insisted her daughter worried too much. 3 years earlier, Naomi had been one semester away from completing her degree in business law. Professors remembered her for asking thoughtful questions instead of trying to impress anyone. She dreamed of working in corporate compliance, believing that honest companies deserved honest leadership and that rules existed to protect people who rarely had power of their own. Then her father passed away unexpectedly. Medical bills arrived faster than paychecks, and college became a luxury their family could no longer afford. Naomi quietly withdrew from school without telling most of her classmates why. She never blamed anyone. She simply found work wherever she could. Waiting tables during the evenings paid more than temporary office jobs, and flexible hours allowed her to care for her mother between appointments at the neighborhood clinic. Customers usually remembered her warm smile before they remembered her name. Managers trusted her because she arrived early, stayed late when someone called in sick, and never complained about difficult guests. Behind that patient smile, however, remained the disciplined mind of someone who still read financial journals during lunch breaks and borrowed corporate governance books from the public library every Saturday. Sometimes after closing, while coworkers talked about weekend plans, Naomi sat alone near the employee lockers with a notebook balanced across her knees. She filled page after page with observations about leadership, ethics, and the invisible choices that determined whether powerful organizations succeeded or collapsed. She believed that integrity was not something people discovered after becoming successful. It was something they practiced long before anyone noticed. Earlier that afternoon, before the dinner rush began, she had recognized several familiar names on the reservation list. Executives, investment attorneys, members connected to one of the largest acquisitions reported in national business news. Most servers simply saw wealthy guests. Naomi noticed patterns. She quietly connected names she had seen in annual reports with faces entering the restaurant, remembering articles she had read during sleepless nights while sitting beside her mother's hospital bed. She never expected to speak to any of them. She certainly did not expect the evening to place her in the center of their attention. Back in the private dining room, the security officers stopped only a few feet away from her. Neither man appeared hostile. They simply looked uncomfortable, exchanging uncertain glances before one of them spoke with practiced professionalism. "Miss Brooks, we are going to ask you to come with us." Naomi offered a small nod and reached for neither apology nor explanation. Her attention remained fixed on the entrance beyond the polished glass walls. The city lights shimmered across the windows like reflections on calm water. Somewhere beyond those doors, the elevator chimed softly. Naomi heard it before anyone else did, and for the first time that evening, the faintest hint of recognition appeared in her eyes. The soft chime from the executive elevator echoed through the lobby with almost perfect timing, but inside the private dining room nobody paid attention. Every eye remained fixed on Richard Coleman. He welcomed that attention. Throughout his entire career, admiration had become as familiar as breathing. Newspapers called him relentless. Financial magazines described him as the executive who transformed struggling companies into market leaders within months. Business schools invited him to lecture about discipline, efficiency, and leadership. Employees admired his confidence from a distance while quietly fearing the impossible standards that followed wherever he went. Richard believed success came from eliminating weakness before weakness could spread. That philosophy had earned him promotions, wealth, and influence, but somewhere along the journey it had also convinced him that appearances revealed character. Expensive suits suggested competence. Luxury restaurants reflected credibility. Executive titles represented intelligence. Service uniforms, in his mind, belonged to people whose opinions stayed invisible. It was a belief he had never questioned because few people ever challenged it. Tonight represented the crowning achievement of everything he had built. Months of confidential negotiations had finally reached the finish line. The acquisition waiting for tomorrow's signature would place Coleman Industries among the largest technology firms in North America. Investors already expected record headlines before the stock market opened. Richard could almost imagine the cameras flashing outside corporate headquarters and the congratulatory calls arriving from television networks eager to interview the newest powerhouse chief executive in American business. Around the polished walnut table, senior attorneys quietly reviewed folders stamped confidential, while financial advisors discussed valuation models in careful whispers. Crystal glasses reflected warm candlelight beside handwritten place cards prepared specifically for the evening. Every detail had been planned to project confidence and absolute control. Richard intended this dinner to leave no doubt about who deserved to lead the company's future. Then Naomi had spoken. She had not interrupted loudly. She had not created a scene. She had simply offered one calm observation that instantly unsettled him. Her words continued echoing in his thoughts even after he dismissed them. "Sir, the wrong people are sitting at your table." The sentence irritated him far more than he wanted to admit. It sounded too deliberate to be random, too confident to come from someone carrying dinner plates only moments earlier. He convinced himself she had overheard fragments of conversation and decided to attract attention. Nothing more. He refused to entertain any other explanation. Across the room, his executive assistant, Daniel Mercer, shifted uneasily while adjusting the cuff of his gray jacket. Daniel had worked beside Richard for nearly 8 years and knew the warning signs better than anyone. Whenever Richard became unusually calm, someone usually paid the price professionally. Daniel glanced toward Naomi, noticing that she still stood with remarkable composure despite the growing tension. That unsettled him almost as much as Richard's reaction. Most employees apologized immediately when confronted by powerful executives. Naomi had not offered excuses, demanded fairness, or pleaded to stay. She simply waited. One investor leaned toward another and whispered, "She seems strangely confident." His companion quietly replied, "Almost like she knows something we do not." Richard overheard the exchange and felt irritation tighten his jaw. He refused to let uncertainty spread through the room on the most important evening of his career. Straightening his jacket, he turned toward the security officers once more. "Please continue," he said firmly. "We have business to finish." Neither officer moved. Both men had instinctively looked beyond Richard toward the restaurant entrance, where several distinguished figures were now walking across the marble lobby with measured, purposeful steps. The polished glass doors swung open without hurry, yet the change in the room was immediate. Conversations disappeared completely. Even the restaurant manager instinctively straightened his posture as 6 distinguished men and women crossed the marble lobby with quiet confidence that no expensive suit alone could create. Their footsteps were measured, unhurried, almost effortless, but every employee recognized the unmistakable presence of people accustomed to making decisions that reshaped entire companies. Richard turned with an automatic smile, expecting another opportunity to reinforce his authority before some of the most influential figures connected to tomorrow's transaction. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and took one confident step forward. "Good evening," he said warmly. "I was not expecting you until 8. No one answered. That silence lingered just long enough to feel unusual. Margaret Ellis led the group without breaking stride. At 61, the chairwoman carried herself with quiet authority earned over 4 decades in corporate governance. She did not need to raise her voice to command attention. Her silver hair framed a composed face that rarely revealed emotion before all the facts were known. Beside her walked 4 independent board directors and the company's chief legal counsel, each carrying slim leather portfolios rather than celebrating with drinks like ordinary dinner guests. Their expressions were professional, focused, almost unusually serious for what Richard believed was supposed to be a congratulatory evening. Richard extended his hand politely. Margaret glanced toward him for barely a second before continuing past without reaching for the handshake. The gesture was subtle, almost invisible, but everyone at the table noticed it. Richard slowly lowered his hand. A faint crease formed between his eyebrows. This was not how board members greeted a chief executive on the eve of the largest acquisition in company history. Daniel Mercer felt the shift immediately. Years of executive meetings had taught him that people rarely ignored Richard Coleman unless something far more important demanded their attention. He quietly stepped backward, allowing the board members to continue through the dining room. The 2 security officers instinctively moved aside, uncertain whether to continue escorting Naomi or wait for new instructions. Margaret finally stopped walking. Not beside Richard. Not near the investors. She stopped only a few feet from Naomi Brooks. For several long seconds, she studied the young waitress standing quietly in her neatly pressed uniform. Naomi met her gaze with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the evening. Neither woman spoke immediately. Around them, the room seemed suspended between 2 completely different realities. Richard cleared his throat. "Madam Chair, I apologize for the interruption. There was an issue with one of the restaurant staff. We are handling it." Margaret slowly turned toward him. Her expression remained controlled, but the warmth had disappeared from her eyes. "Are you?" she asked softly. Richard hesitated. Something about the question unsettled him. It did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like evaluation. Before he could answer, Margaret looked back at Naomi. "Miss Brooks," she said with unmistakable respect, "I trust you were not kept waiting long." Several investors exchanged startled glances. One attorney nearly dropped his pen onto the table. The restaurant manager blinked twice, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Naomi offered a polite smile. "Not at all, ma'am," she replied. "I knew you would arrive exactly when you intended to." Margaret nodded once, almost approvingly, then reached into the leather folder tucked beneath her arm. Richard watched the movement with growing confusion as she removed a sealed envelope bearing the official corporate insignia. His confidence began to fade for the first time that evening, because he suddenly realized the meeting he believed he controlled had never truly been about him at all. Richard Coleman stared at the envelope as though its embossed corporate seal belonged to someone else's reality. His confident posture remained perfectly straight, yet the certainty behind it had begun to fracture. Margaret Ellis held the document without opening it immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to settle across the dining room, understanding that moments of truth rarely needed dramatic words. They only needed patience. Around the long table, every executive had stopped pretending to review financial reports. Every investor watched without speaking. Even the restaurant staff remained respectfully still near the walls, sensing that the evening had quietly transformed into something none of them had expected. Richard forced a polite smile back onto his face. "Madam Chair," he said carefully, "if there is something important regarding tomorrow's agenda, perhaps we should continue this discussion in a private conference room." Margaret looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes. "This discussion has always belonged here," she replied, "because leadership is revealed most clearly when no one expects to be evaluated." Richard felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He searched the faces of the other board members, hoping someone would smile, nod, or offer an explanation. None did. They stood quietly beside Margaret as though they had rehearsed this moment together. Finally, she opened the envelope and removed several neatly organized documents. She handed one copy to the chief legal counsel before looking back at Naomi. "Miss Brooks," she said warmly, "thank you for honoring our request to keep your identity confidential until this evening." A wave of confusion swept across the room. Daniel Mercer blinked in disbelief. Several investors exchanged puzzled glances. The restaurant manager looked from Naomi to Richard and back again, struggling to understand what confidential identity could possibly belong to a waitress who had spent the evening serving water and dinner plates. Richard frowned. "Identity," he repeated. Margaret nodded. "For the past 7 months, our Ethics and Governance Committee has received detailed anonymous reports concerning operational risks, procurement irregularities, and compliance failures inside this organization. Every submission included supporting documentation, precise timelines, and practical recommendations. Independent audits confirmed every single finding." Richard slowly folded his arms. "And what does that have to do with her?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "She wrote them." The words landed with quiet force. Nobody gasped. Nobody interrupted. The silence itself became heavier than any reaction. Richard looked directly at Naomi, waiting for her to deny it. She did not. Her expression remained humble, almost apologetic that the truth had become public. "That is impossible," Richard said at last. "She is a waitress." Margaret's voice remained calm. "She is also someone who understands corporate governance, financial controls, and ethical compliance remarkably well." Naomi finally spoke, her tone gentle enough that it never sounded defensive. "I only reported what I believe could protect the company and the people who depend on it. I never expected recognition." Richard searched her face again, remembering the quiet confidence, the carefully chosen words, and the strange certainty she had carried from the very beginning of the evening. Suddenly, her warning no longer sounded random. It sounded intentional. Every small detail he had dismissed returned to him with uncomfortable clarity. The board members had not come to celebrate his success. They had come to verify the judgment of the woman he had ordered removed only minutes earlier. For the first time in years, Richard realized that he had measured a person's worth by a uniform instead of by character, and that single mistake had unfolded before witnesses whose opinions could shape not only tomorrow's announcement, but the future of his entire career. The room remained so quiet that the faint hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed louder than the voices inside. Snow had begun to drift gently across the Chicago skyline, soft white flakes floating beneath the golden glow of the streetlights nearly 30 stories below. Candlelight reflected across crystal glasses that no one reached for anymore. Richard Coleman slowly lowered himself into his chair without realizing he had done so. The commanding executive who had entered the restaurant convinced the evening belonged to him now sat motionless, staring at the woman he had failed to see. Naomi did not celebrate. She did not smile with satisfaction or look around the room expecting admiration. Instead, she quietly picked up the serving tray she had set aside earlier and placed it neatly back onto the service station, almost by habit. It was a small movement, ordinary and unremarkable, yet somehow it became the most powerful gesture of the night. Margaret Ellis watched silently before speaking. "Do you know why we asked Miss Brooks to remain anonymous?" she asked the room. No one answered. "Because we wanted every conclusion reached tonight to be based on character instead of reputation." Her words settled gently into the silence. Daniel Mercer looked down at the polished table, replaying dozens of conversations from the previous months. There had been anonymous reports. There had been recommendations so carefully written that entire departments had quietly corrected procedures without ever learning who had uncovered the problems. He had assumed those reports came from a senior compliance consultant or an outside legal advisor. Never once had he imagined the author was someone who spent evenings delivering meals with steady hands and greeting strangers with genuine kindness. Margaret turned another page inside the folder. "Miss Brooks declined financial compensation on 3 separate occasions," she said. "She requested only one thing, that every recommendation be evaluated on its merit rather than on the identity of the person submitting it." Several board members nodded almost imperceptibly. One elderly director removed his glasses and slowly polished the lenses with a folded handkerchief before quietly saying, "That alone tells us everything we need to know." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered every assumption he had made within the last 20 minutes. He remembered believing confidence belonged only to executives, intelligence belonged only to titles, and authority belonged only to those wearing expensive suits. Yet the person who had demonstrated the greatest integrity all evening wore a simple restaurant apron with a plastic name tag pinned over her heart. Naomi finally broke the silence, speaking so softly that everyone instinctively leaned forward to hear. "I never wanted anyone to feel embarrassed tonight," she said. "I only hoped the company would become stronger. Thousands of families depend on its future. That matters much more than proving someone wrong." Richard looked at her, unable to find an immediate reply. The apology forming inside him felt heavier than any presentation he had ever delivered because it demanded something he had rarely offered in business: humility. Beyond the windows, the snowfall became slightly thicker, covering the rooftops with a quiet blanket of white. Inside the restaurant, nobody rushed to continue dinner. Nobody reached for contracts or business projections. For the first time that evening, profit no longer felt like the most important subject in the room. Character did. And in the gentle stillness that followed, Richard began to understand that the strongest leaders were not the ones who spoke the loudest, but the ones who recognized wisdom even when it arrived wearing the uniform of someone the world too often overlooked. Richard Coleman rose from his chair more slowly than anyone had ever seen. The confidence that had once filled every movement was gone, replaced by the unmistakable weight of reflection. He looked around the private dining room, noticing details that had escaped him earlier. The servers waiting quietly beside the walls. The security officers who had simply followed instructions without question. The investors whose expressions no longer reflected admiration but careful observation. For years he had believed leadership meant always appearing certain. Tonight had taught him that certainty without humility could become its own blind spot. Margaret Ellis closed the folder and placed it gently on the polished table. "There is one more reason we invited everyone here tonight," she said. Richard lifted his eyes toward her. "The acquisition has never been our only evaluation." The words settled over the room like the snowfall outside. "Our governance committee has spent the last 6 months reviewing not only financial performance, but executive judgment, ethical leadership, and organizational culture. Numbers build companies. Character keeps them standing." One board member nodded before adding, "Balance sheets reveal profit." Moments like this reveal people. Richard swallowed quietly. Every sentence seemed to remove another layer of certainty he had carried for decades. Margaret turned toward Naomi once again. "Miss Brooks, would you be willing to explain why you warned Mr. Coleman before we arrived?" Naomi hesitated for only a moment. "Because I believed he still deserved the opportunity to make a different choice," she answered softly. Several people looked at her with surprise. Richard's expression changed completely. "You were trying to help me?" he asked, almost unable to believe the question leaving his own mouth. Naomi nodded gently. "I noticed several board members entering the lobby through the front windows before anyone else did. When I said the wrong people were sitting at your table, I hoped you would understand that the evening was about to change. I thought perhaps you might pause before asking security to escort me out." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Every painful realization now fit together with perfect clarity. She had never challenged his authority. She had tried to protect his reputation. The warning he dismissed as inappropriate had actually been an act of quiet kindness. Daniel Mercer slowly exhaled, finally understanding the entire sequence of events. "She gave us every chance," he whispered almost to himself. Margaret looked directly at Richard. "True integrity often arrives quietly. The question is whether we are willing to recognize it before it is too late." Richard turned toward Naomi again. For the first time that evening, he truly saw the person standing before him. Not a uniform, not a job title, not someone serving dinner. He saw a woman who had sacrificed her education to care for her family, who had anonymously protected a corporation without asking for credit, and who had even attempted to spare the very executive who had judged her unfairly. The realization struck him harder than any failed negotiation ever could. Around the room, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the soft piano music beginning again somewhere beyond the dining room. Gentle notes floating through the restaurant like a reminder that even after difficult moments, grace was still possible. Richard drew a slow breath, understanding that the next words he chose would define him far more than any quarterly earnings report ever had. Richard Coleman took one slow step toward Naomi Brooks, then another, until only a few feet separated them. No one interrupted. No one reached for a contract or glanced at a phone. Every person in the room understood that whatever happened next would matter far more than tomorrow's acquisition. Richard looked at the simple name tag resting against Naomi's uniform, remembering how quickly he had allowed that small piece of plastic to define her value. His shoulders relaxed as though carrying a burden he had only just discovered. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that should have come much sooner." His voice was steady, but the confidence it carried was different now. It no longer came from authority. It came from honesty. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I saw your position instead of your character. I ignored your warning when you were trying to protect both this company and me. There is no justification for that." The silence that followed felt warm rather than uncomfortable. Naomi met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the evening. She did not rush to answer. Margaret Ellis watched without speaking, allowing the moment to belong entirely to the two people standing before one another. Richard continued, "I have spent years asking employees to earn my respect. Tonight, I realized respect should have been where I started." Several members of the board exchanged quiet nods. Daniel Mercer lowered his eyes, recognizing that he had also overlooked people whose titles seemed too small to matter. Naomi finally smiled, not because she had won, but because she believed difficult truths could become the beginning of better choices. "Everyone makes decisions they wish they could take back," she said gently. "The important part is deciding what kind of person you become afterward." Richard absorbed every word. They were not spoken with pride or resentment. They carried only compassion that made them even harder to forget. Margaret stepped forward and placed another document on the table. "The governance committee has reached a unanimous decision," she announced. "Effective immediately, we would like to offer Miss Naomi Brooks a position as Special Ethics and Compliance Advisor while she completes the remainder of her business law degree. The company will provide full tuition assistance and flexible scheduling if she chooses to accept." A quiet murmur spread around the room. Naomi looked genuinely surprised. I did not expect this," she admitted softly. Margaret smiled for the first time that evening. "We are not rewarding you for exposing problems. We are recognizing the integrity you demonstrated while doing it. Naomi looked toward Richard before answering. I will accept only if one condition is met. Richard immediately nodded. Name it. She glanced around the dining room, including every server, manager, dishwasher, and security officer who had remained respectfully silent throughout the evening. Treat every person who works for this company with the same dignity, regardless of the uniform they wear or the title on their business card. That change will matter more than any position you offer me. Richard extended his hand, not as a chief executive addressing an employee, but as one human being asking another for the opportunity to do better. Naomi accepted the handshake with quiet grace. There was no applause. There was no celebration. Only a room filled with people who had just witnessed something far more valuable than a successful business deal. They had watched humility meet kindness, and kindness had chosen forgiveness instead of revenge. The following Monday morning, the first light of winter spilled across the glass headquarters of Coleman Industries, turning every window into a mirror reflecting the quiet promise of a new beginning. Employees entered the building carrying coffee cups, laptop bags, and the familiar weight of another workday. But something inside had unmistakably changed. The atmosphere felt lighter. Receptionists greeted maintenance crews by name. Executives held elevator doors instead of rushing inside. Managers paused to thank employees whose work usually passed unnoticed. No company policy could create that kind of transformation overnight. It had begun with a single moment when everyone witnessed the true cost of judging a person before knowing their character. Naomi Brooks walked through the front entrance wearing a navy business suit instead of her restaurant uniform, yet her smile remained exactly the same. She stopped at the security desk before continuing upstairs. Good morning, she said warmly to the two officers who had once been asked to escort her outside. Both men smiled with genuine respect. Good morning, Miss Brooks. One of them quietly added, Congratulations. Naomi thanked him with the same humility she had shown when carrying dinner trays only days before. Titles had changed. Her heart had not. On the executive floor, Margaret Ellis welcomed her personally before introducing her to colleagues from ethics, legal affairs, and compliance. Richard Coleman waited near the conference room windows overlooking the city. As Naomi approached, he extended a folder instead of a speech. Inside was a handwritten letter. I wanted my first decision after our meeting to reflect what I learned, he said. Every employee, regardless of position, will now participate in leadership forums where ideas can be shared directly with senior management. Good judgment should never be ignored because of a job title. Naomi looked up with quiet appreciation. That will help many people feel heard, she replied. Richard nodded. Including me. Later that afternoon, Naomi visited the employee cafeteria instead of the executive dining room. She sat beside housekeepers, kitchen staff, receptionists, accountants, and interns, listening far more than she spoke. She asked thoughtful questions, wrote careful notes, and thanked everyone who shared an idea for improving the company. Several employees admitted it was the first time anyone from leadership had ever asked for their perspective. Naomi simply smiled because she understood something many organizations forgot. The people closest to the work often saw the truth first. Weeks passed, and small changes slowly became lasting habits. Anonymous reporting increased because employees trusted their voices mattered. Collaboration improved across departments. Customer satisfaction rose. Independent auditors later described the company's ethical culture as one of the strongest in its industry. Financial success followed, but this time it rested on a stronger foundation than quarterly earnings alone. One snowy evening after work, Richard stood beside the same restaurant window where he had once watched Naomi through the narrow lens of assumption. Outside, fresh snow covered the sidewalks in quiet white, softening the noise of the city below. He noticed a young server helping an elderly couple gather their coats before they stepped into the cold. Richard smiled to himself, recognizing dignity in an ordinary act he might once have overlooked. Some lessons arrived through success. Others arrived through humility. The most important ones changed the way a person saw everyone afterward. Across the street, Naomi walked toward the train station carrying a stack of law books beneath one arm and calling her mother to say she would be home in time for dinner. The winter wind brushed gently across the sidewalk as the city lights shimmered around her. She disappeared into the evening with the same quiet grace that had carried her through every challenge, leaving behind no triumphal speech, no celebration, only the enduring truth that kindness was never weakness, character never depended on status, and real justice often arrived in silence.